Okay, so I want to continue our discussion of solvents and how they affect reaction rates for substitution versus elimination. And we'll first start by thinking about the effect of protic solvents on nucleophilicity. And the theme here is going to be that the protic solvents, recall things like alcohols, that have a great deal of positive charge on the hydrogen. These are going to form interactions with and stabilize anionic nucleophiles. So let's consider the case of a fluoride ion, which is quite small, and the 2p shell versus iodide, which is 3 slots lower on the periodic table, has a 5p orbital. The negative charge in fluoride is spread out throughout a very small volume, and therefore it's quite charge dense. And that's why it's a stronger base, or it has a higher affinity for a proton, such as a proton in a protic solvent. And so if you were to put this fluoride ion in an alcohol solvent, or anything protic, you would get immediate hydrogen bonding between the fluoride and the alcohol. And I think you get the point. This is quite extensive, and the fluoride ion is going to basically be covered up by protons on all sides, which means it's going to be well solvated. And it doesn't really own this negative charge anymore. Therefore, it's less nucleophilic.